Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Heartily welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of our conference speakers. We are looking so much forward to discussing your extremely fascinating and interesting research the next couple of days. Welcome to all of our conference participants. We are excited and thrilled to see you here and that you took time out of your calendars to learn more about the global intellectual history of an unequal world. My name is Olaf Christiansen. I'm an associate professor in the history of ideas and principal investigator of the research project An Intellectual History of Global Inequality 1960 to 2015. On behalf of the rest of our team, Danish PhD student Melanie Guichon, Argentinian postdoc Sofia Mercader, and Indian associated researcher Dr. Priyanka Jha, I am very delighted to welcome all of you to our two-day symposium titled Towards a Global Intellectual History of an Unequal World, 1945 till today. This two-day symposium is designed to investigate the global intellectual history of inequality. It will do so through a double global lens. How have intellectuals from around the world thought about inequality in the world? In a few minutes, or about 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe, I will give the word to our first distinguished keynote speaker, Professor and intellectual historian Siep Stuurman. Siep will speak for about 50 minutes over the title, Is Free Trade Always Superior to Protectionism? Myth and History in Thinking Global Economic Inequality, after which there will be ample time for questions. Please note that this session is being recorded, and I kindly ask you to make sure that you are muted for now. Allow me, however, to begin somewhere else with where this project started. On September 17th, 2019, our research project was officially inaugurated with a public talk by Professor of Historical and Political Geography Simon Reed-Henry, who will also present a paper later today. Simon's excellent talk marked the beginning of a very special journey, the start of our new research project. It was a journey that, as I prophesied back then, would have its ups and its downs, its new discoveries and its detours and much more. And I said this without having the slightest of clue about the bumpy road ahead of us. Neither good nor particularly comfortable making up prophecies, not exactly the business of most intellectual historians. This one prophecy turned out for once to be highly accurate, as the global pandemic would complicate our work in so many unforeseen and numerous ways in the years to come, becoming almost like a traveling companion of our project in a very unwelcomed way. The journey, so I know the metaphor is getting somewhat worn, but I am even less of a poet than a prophet. We set out for ourselves was an intellectual journey, investigating the intellectual history of an unequal world, aiming to produce new insights and knowledge. For me, it was a globalizing, more inclusive intellectual history journey that set out to try to understand other countries' and regions' histories of thought, guided by what I believe is a fundamental ambition in intellectual history and the humanities more broadly, trying to understand how other people view the world, or to see things their way, as Quentin Skinner once put it. It was a moral journey because it starts out from the observation that global inequalities are far too high in a world in which the most fundamental choices in life is where one chooses to be born, as economist Branko Milanovic and sociologist Ayet Jakar has reminded us in her wonderful and thought-provoking book, The Birthright Lottery. The journey ran into much obstacles, however, in being a journey in the literal sense of the word, as our plans of traveling to and exploring other countries, investigating their past and present day perspectives on global inequality, stranded due to the pandemic. Our research project asked the following overall question, namely, what is the relationship between geographical anchoring or place and how people have thought about international and global economic inequality? More specifically, our own project focuses mainly upon 4 countries, Argentina, Ghana, India, the US, and 4 clusters of public intellectuals. And we ask questions like, how has international economic inequality been conceptualized? What were the dominant past expectations for the future of international inequality? To which extent was inequality thought to be legitimate, just, useful? Our project investigates links, differences, and similarities between different intellectual traditions, as well as the circulation of inequality concepts and knowledge across countries. In this symposium, we look forward to achieving one of our most noble objectives, to aspire to create a unique transcultural and multilinguistic knowledge about inequality concepts, contributing to the fields of global intellectual and conceptual history, as well as to inequality studies more broadly, and most importantly, to do so in collaboration with all you wonderful international colleagues. Let me now say a few more words about the background for the symposium, its aims, and the key questions we hope to explore together with you during the next couple of days. First, we need a new global intellectual history of inequality, one that brings in many more countries, languages, and connections. We believe this symposium can help facilitate a new discussion on the global intellectual history of inequality, contributing to global intellectual history and the intellectual histories of inequality. I don't know how many times I'm using the words intellectual and inequality and history, but that's what we're doing here. Studies of global inequality have certainly surged in the social sciences and the humanities in the last couple of decades. However, we do not yet have much of an intellectual history of global inequality. By contrast, in intellectual history, many studies on inequality have tended to focus on canonical works or a nation state setting. There's a genuine need for a transnational and transcontinental perspective, which not only compares different geographical spaces, but also studies the connectivity in important exchanges of ideas and concepts within the South and between North and South. While critics of global intellectual history have rightfully pointed out that few connections are actually truly global or planetary, they can perhaps more adequately be described as transnational, transcultural, transcolonial, transimperial connections. Taking this criticism into account, we need to learn more about the intellectual histories of inequality in non-Western countries, including in non-English indigenous languages. And our histories need not be truly global, but we can ask what we could call globalizing questions, inquiring into how this or that development connects to broader pictures. As indicated in the title of our symposium, Towards a Global Intellectual History of Inequality, it is and will remain an unfinished project. Inequality is certainly also surging as a theme in economics, sociology, history of knowledge, and other disciplines. From longue durée studies by Walter Scheidel to Thomas Piketty's work on the relationship between capital and inequality, to studies on the impact of inequality on crime, health, and much more, there's a growing interest in inequality in academia. If, as Piketty suggests in his most recent book, ideas count in the history of inequality, it is certainly worthwhile visiting past thoughts on inequality. Whereas Piketty himself mainly studies what he calls inequality regimes and how inequalities were justified, an intellectual history perspective looks into many more aspects of inequality thinking. It is important to note also that inequality is a multidimensional phenomenon, and many different terminologies exist, distinguishing between, for example, national, international, and global inequality, inequalities of class, gender, and race, ethnicity, horizontal versus vertical inequalities, recognition versus redistribution also taps into some of this, and so forth. Economic inequality very often intersects with other inequalities. And it is an empirical question what kinds of inequalities intellectuals addressed in the past and what kind of world they understood themselves to belong to. For some, being woman, being Black, or being part of a lower caste was even more defining for their world than living in particular places, be they nation states, centers or peripheries of empire, or being a citizen of the world. While we're very interested in histories of intellectuals reflecting on being part of an unequal world, we acknowledge that the historical experience of what constitutes a person's world is highly historically contingent too. To sum up so far, the kinds of questions we hope we can ask ourselves and each other during the next couple of days are something like these. What does a globalizing intellectual history perspective add? What does the specific setting, place, context mean for thinking on inequality? How does this contribute relate to the global intellectual history of inequality? How were inequalities legitimized and critiqued in history? Which futures of inequality and equality did historical actors envision? Let me motivate a little more why a global intellectual history perspective on inequality not only is an important contribution to intellectual history, but why it also is important to look at more broadly. Inequality simply is and remains a key challenge in the 21st century. In 2015, the United Nations adopted a new set of world goals, including bringing down inequality both within and between countries. While there's reason also to applaud the reduction of absolute poverty in recent history, such progress should not overshadow the facts of still grotesque poverty and extreme inequality, widespread precarity, slavery, human trafficking, exploitation, child labor, climate change, water shortages, and so on. Current estimates of global poverty reduction and their success stories are also based upon extremely conservative measures of what constitutes a decent living wage. In one recent account, only 5% of the new income from global growth goes to the poorest 60% of humanity. The current triumphalist stories about the betterment of the human condition certainly illustrate what intellectual historian Sam Moyn has rightly pointed out as being minimalist sufficiency norms rather than representing high ambitions of equality and access to the good things in life. As Amartya Sen stated, some people may have become less poor in absolute terms, but there's still a huge disparity in people's capabilities and quality of life. Even taking the good news into account, we are not doing well enough on global justice. And this is another reason why we need to revisit the intellectual histories of inequality. The global pandemic itself has certainly reminded us of present-day inequalities, from huge country variation in impacts, access to medical help, to workforces more exposed to getting the virus, to heightened vulnerabilities of immigrants, refugees, and minorities, to the world's most wealthy individuals becoming only richer during the pandemic. By looking more deeply into the cultural and intellectual historical background of global inequalities, researchers can hope to deliver important inputs to such debates. If we stretch our imagination a little bit, we will see that the world we inhabit is not a natural and necessary one, but a contingent one. In fact, this is a classic point in the field of intellectual history, that reality is historical, and the historical reality of today is saturated with layers and layers of contingency. It is the product of a series of choices and structures which could have gone in different directions. Before I finally give the word to Sib, a few different informations. Coffee and refreshments. All coffee and other refreshments are on the house being your own. Twitter, if you want to do something on Twitter, we have a Twitter handle. It is Global Ineq, I-N-E-Q. Restrooms should be located exactly where you usually find them. An apology. Allow me to try to make an apology on behalf of all of us before we start. Sophia, Melanie, Priyanka, and I have come to the conclusion that it is simply impossible to pronounce all names, historical figures, indigenous concepts that appear in all your wonderful papers correctly. So please bear with us all. We'll try as the best we can. Zoom, please make sure you are muted when you are not speaking. There's a journal special issue arrangement. So this is for conference speakers. We are aiming at publishing some of your articles in a special issue of the journal Global Intellectual History. It will depend upon where we'll see the best fit. We can only host, it looks now, about 7 articles, and we'll get back to you all after the symposium to let you know how we plan to proceed from here. And you can also feel free to contact me directly about this question. The symposium is sponsored by Independent Research Fund Denmark with its Sebbe Aude Research Leader Grant An Intellectual History of Global Inequality 1960 to 2015. So thank you so much to Independent Research Fund Denmark.